August 21, 2021. This is going to be an email from Howard to Matt Bryant, who worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was regarding a call I had with Kevin Wick. So there's a lot of abbreviations in here, like KW for Kevin. And I want to be clear that these are just Kevin's opinions and mine and Howie's, of course. And so it's maybe not as clear as I go through this because it's abbreviated so much. So I just wanted to say that in advance. Matt, you may or may not be aware that there is a fellow named Kevin Wick who was incarcerated for over a year with Maldonado when Maldonado, I don't know why he always calls him that. He was Maldonado for like this long. Who was incarcerated for over a year with Maldonado when Maldonado was held at the Grady County facility awaiting trial. They lived in a small medical pod that I think only held 8 prisoners max. Kevin had many hours of conversation with Joe, and overhearing Joe on the phone. He kept notes about his experience and wrote a very short book that is on Amazon called A Year with a King in a Cage. He is currently held in the El Reno Federal Correctional Institute in Oklahoma. He's not there now, so I can say that's where he was. About 2 months ago, Kevin reached out to Carole by mail, and last week Carole had 2 15-minute phone conversations with him. Of course, the calls were recorded by the prison, attached to our notes from the conversation. I have yellow highlighted the most relevant portions. I would appreciate it if you would review these and give me a call at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Howard Baskin. So at 11:10:17, we asked if it was okay to record. At 10:42, he says Joe is a crybaby. At 11:05, dreams that Black Bear was a black man and we shot him and buried in a pet cemetery, boneyard, or back 40. Doesn't believe it happened. KW asked if he, quote, knew how to tell the truth, unquote. Joe said, sometimes not sure. Joe said, quote, sometimes I can't differentiate, unquote. 12:02, Joe said, quote, I put my mutts out of misery all the time, unquote. KW said, quote, I'm telling you, if a tiger under his possession had a toothache, it had a death sentence if it was old and ornery and wasn't cubbable, meaning it couldn't have cubs, unquote. 12:43, this was with him, when I was with him, Tiger King had not come out, so I did not know who he was. Quote, I think he is probably guilty of many crimes that he was just a really mean man, and he certainly was abusive with his sexual conduct, unquote. 14:05, Joe, quote, I'm a king, unquote. KW said, quote, he pretty much grabbed a hold of that king mentality. Joe said, quote, in my kingdom, boys are men when they reach puberty, unquote. Kevin said, quote, he would say things like, oh, what I could teach that kid, unquote. 14:50, Kevin had spinal surgery and was in this small medical pod, and that is how he ran across Joe. 15:30, Carole Baskin, what does the world need to know about Joe? KW replied, quote, Joe is abusive. He is a malignant narcissist. There is no doubt about that. He is very cruel. He has no love for animals. When he got on the phone, he started ratting out every one of the cub handler circus masters, fellow, and Tarzan wannabes that he had in his circus and in his directory, saying, they can't do this to me. Name is doing this and name is doing that. 16:30, KW warned him against ratting out people in a prison setting, saying, quote, Joe had no love for tigers. He had no love at all for tigers. He had no love for animals. He told me he would get these adopted, malnourished horses and put them in with the cats and watch them play with them like a cat with a mouse, unquote. Kevin came from a horse breeding background, breeding champions, and said, quote, it broke my heart. You know, I couldn't believe that he would do that and think it was funny, unquote. 18:10, Joe liked to post pictures on the wall. Kevin said, quote, the only tiger picture he ever posted up was where he was on the cover of a magazine. He did not have any pictures where he said, this is my beloved cat. He never talked about his tiger or his cats with any affection. 20:02, Carole asked, did Joe talk about Jeff Lowe being involved in a murder for hire? And Kevin answered, quote, Jeff and there was another hand that was working there at the place where they were kind of trying to fund him to take care of you, unquote. 20.29, Carole asked, do you feel safe in answering whether or not you felt like Joe still wants to kill me, unquote? Kevin said, quote, oh, there's no doubt that Joe is not a reformed man in any form or fashion. Joe told me over and over, he said, I'd give my life to take yours. You know, I said, Joe, you're not very successful at taking your own life because he tried all the time, half-heartedly, more for attention, unquote. 21.07. Sister tells him Joe saying publicly that he has cancer. Kevin said, quote, if Joe is putting that out, it's just a publicity ploy, unquote. He doesn't have medical issues. 22.27. Carole asked if Joe ever admitted to trying to kill her, but Prism 15-minute call ends the call. 12.09.20. Kevin had DUIs, no accidents, 4 years sober, fled to avoid arrest, 11 months since attorney had oral arguments for appeal in 10th Circuit, expecting ruling any time, possible overturn, new trial, or resentence, down to a year if it does not get any help. Originally left out of book some of the more demented things because he's not sure of the legal implications, talking about Joe's demented things. 10.50, plans to include notes he has about Carole and Lowe trading kittens for sex and Joe's involvement, who he was involved in the crime he was convicted on primarily, which was the murder for hire towards you. I knew the government did not need my help to convict him on that. 11.20. Kevin said, quote, he ranted and raved and even yelled on the phone there in the pod how he felt about you. I didn't even know your name for a while because he only referred to you with a cuss word. It was his whole demented thing, unquote. 11:58. Kevin said he told me things like what made him gay that are really gross, and if people knew, they would think differently about him. I've never seen Tiger King. Everything I have is what I heard from Joe. 12.50. Kevin said, quote, the main thing I would say about Joe Exotic is he had such a hate for you that, and this is why I'm telling you this, Carole, as long as he could find anybody to damage you physically, emotionally, mentally, any way, he will always try to do that, unquote. He played off the idea that he tried to have Carole killed, saying, I was just acting. I wasn't trying to entice anyone to hurt Carole. But, quote, he said, forget the quote, entice anyone to hurt Carole, quote, but I would give, and he's quoting Joe here, quote, but I would give my life to take hers, unquote. 13:50. Kevin said, quote, you are to him the reason that he is in prison. You are the downfall of his life. You are the devil. As long as he could find a following or anybody, no, I don't think you would ever be safe if he obviously had anyone who would do his bidding. And I say that because I don't think, well, for one thing, it is totally immoral, wrong, and I don't think that you deserve that, unquote. 15.10. Carole expresses concern that in prison he has a more dangerous audience to rile up against her and asks if he saw any evidence of that. Kevin said, quote, in county jail I did, unquote, Grady County Detention Center. And then this was a piece that Howie had highlighted. 16.04. It was the state inmates that were coming into our medical pod because they had a violent crime against somebody local and they couldn't be in with the general population or something. And then Kevin says, quote, he would try to slip notes out. He would write notes, instructions, and when they were going to court, they would hand them off to trustees who would hand them off, and that would go into the public sector. So he was actively trying to get you while in custody at the time that I was with him, unquote. 17:10. Kevin says, quote, I say in my book, who wouldn't be afraid of this man? He would treat these people he called his fag hags, the gay community that supported him, and didn't have any love for them either. He called them his fag hags, like in his mind, he was some kind of star that superseded all reality and all rules of law and all consciousness behavior. He was a shocking, immoral individual, unquote. Kevin went on to say, I was studying in the law library, working on my case. He laid right at my feet, physically watching TV because he had, quote, a broken bottom, unquote, problems. He would act like he was allergic to the steel seating, so he got medical permission to pull his mat out there and lay on the ground. 19. Carole asked, what would you say to the people who say he was not serious about having me killed? Kevin said, quote, and this was another area that Howie highlighted, Joe wanted you dead, Carole. There is absolutely no question in my mind. If I had thought for a minute that he wasn't going to be convicted, I would have probably said something. I have a mother and I have a sister. I have 3 daughters, and I'm a human and not a violent person. I had no doubt that he was going to be convicted because he barked it out constantly, and I read all his papers. It was pretty clear that he had paid people. He had actually transferred funds for your demise, so there is no doubt that he wanted you dead, and he knew also that you were not guilty of killing your husband. He absolutely knew that. I called him out on that, unquote. Kevin argues that there would have been charges. Kevin said, quote, he said, it didn't happen. I know it didn't happen, unquote. 2040, again, another area that Howie highlighted. Kevin said, quote, he believed that if you told a lie enough, it would become the truth. The following would believe him. You know, he was the product of a lie. He almost believed his own lies, even when it made no sense at all. But he knew for a fact that you were not guilty of what he indeed was guilty of, unquote. 21.00. Carole said, what would you say to people who are trying to get him out of prison now? Kevin said, I'm in prison, and I'm not one to advocate for anybody being in prison, but there are a lot of people in prison who deserve to be in prison. Let's just get that straight. I'm not an anti-prison or anti-law and order person. We make mistakes. We pay the price. We reform. Hopefully, we recommit our lives in a civil society. And then this is highlighted because he said, Joe is not capable of living in a civil society and not taking vengeance out on those he perceived to have harmed him. And you are enemy number 1. So there is no doubt in my mind that if he was ever cut loose and able to ever rally, he would promote your demise, which I think would put you in a life-threatening situation. You can't have bodyguards and security around you all the time. There's going to be some fanatic out there that he could probably induce into being a murderer. 22.30, still highlighted. He goes on to say, I think Joe is a murderer anyway, so he has already crossed the line. I think there is something to do with him killing somebody on his property. I think there is some backbone to that. I think there is some truth, unquote. If you're enjoying my diary, please like, share, and subscribe. You can find other ways to connect to me over at bigcatrescue.org/Carole.Baskin.